So I'm recording my homily for the 31st Sunday in Ordinary Time, and I am down here in Tulalip. Our church, St. Anne's, is just right up the hill there, and so we have their marina is right here, and the mountains, I don't know if the quality is good enough to see, but the mountains that are just right back here, those are the Olympic Mountains that is across Puget Sound from us. So a very cold day. Beautiful day though, very cold. So I'm continuing to talk about stewardship. So stewardship, remember there's three basic components in the Catholic Church when we talk about stewardship, and it's really how we use ourselves in the service of the gospel, in the service of Jesus Christ. And so one is how we use our things, especially, our money, our possessions, how we use them in the service of the gospel. So we call that treasure. How we use our time. Now, generally, really what we're talking about when we talk about time in stewardship, we're talking about our spiritual lives, how we spend our time in the service of the gospel, our spiritual component of our life. So I say spiritual and charity. And then the third portion of stewardship is our talents, which is how are we using what God has given us in terms of internal talents, whether it's our wisdom, whether it's what we've learned over the years, whether we've learned in terms of our faith, and how are we then sharing that, passing that on, okay? All right, so I'm going to talk about that today. Now, the last 2 weeks I've talked about the one component of stewardship, which was treasure. And so the first week I talked about the dangers of money. Not that money's bad, but that money can be used bad. And so corruption can enter into our own hearts, and it can enter into the church, it can enter into our government, it can enter into companies, but it first starts inside. And so when we talk about stewardship, we want to make sure that we guard ourselves against that greedy, self-centered corruption that can slowly enter in. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. But then last week I talked about the good side of money, the good side of using our belongings, because we can use them for good. We can use them for the service of the gospel. Okay? All right, so that's where we're at today. Now, a couple weeks ago in my letter that I sent home to all the parishioners, I talked about how we wanted to focus on stewardship in three ways. And there's nothing huge about these three ways. They were very practical. I'm going to share all three of them here today and then go a little bit deeper with them. So the first is the treasure, and that is the stewardship card. So by making a commitment to the parish, we're just elevating our sense of responsibility to the parish, that it's not, that we're not just volunteers, it's not optional, nor are we enslaved, nor are we forced to do it, but as stewards we want to do it, because the model of stewardship really is a family model. We're brothers and sisters, we want to take care of each other, we want to help each other, and so as a church. So the card helps to elevate people, especially people who maybe are not quite as connected or quite as feeling maybe connected. It gives them a sense of responsibility in that. So I'm asking all parishioners, every family, to fill out a stewardship card and to make a commitment in just that. Somebody asked me, does that mean that we have to use our envelopes? Does that mean that the parish is trying to track how much we give? No, not at all, not at all. The amount is between you and God, but the commitment is necessary for the community if we're going to thrive rather than just survive. Okay? All right. Okay, so that was the first area. It was everybody using the commitment card. I have to say our success at that is far from perfect at this point, but we'll keep working on it. The second component was time. And so remember the spiritual and the charity. And so I set a goal for our parish. And the goal is that everyone in the parish, everyone who's completing a stewardship card, everyone who's registered, is coming to Mass every single Sunday. And I want to reinstill that. And it's not just a matter of just obedience, but it's a matter of being a family. It's like if kids were not coming home for dinner and you wanted to have a family dinner and they're just not showing up, it means something's wrong. And if they don't want to be there for dinner, it means something's really wrong. So it's reestablishing our sense of a community as a parish, that every single Sunday, everybody's expected to be there. There is nothing more important than coming together to worship the living God together as a family. Now, there are two exceptions that don't make it more important, but that God understands, okay? And so the exceptions are this. One is when somebody is ill to the point where they really should not be at Mass because they're going to spread what they have, or they're just not capable of being there because of their illness. God understands that, okay? It's not God saying that, your illness is more important. It's just saying God understands that. The other component to that is when we're taking care of someone who's ill, or taking care of a newborn baby, or doing something where we simply cannot get to Mass. Now, usually there's ways we can. You have somebody come in and take care of the person for an hour or two while you go to Mass, right? But if there's circumstances where there's no possible way to get to Mass because you're caring for somebody who's ill, or somebody who just needs that 24-hour care, God understands that also. It doesn't mean that it's more important than the Mass. It just means God understands. So there's no sin there if a person misses Mass because he had no way to get to Mass because of that. Okay. The third is if somebody has a job where there's no possible way for them to get to Mass. Okay, so fishermen who are out on a fishing vessel, there's no way they can come into shore to go to Mass when they're out in the Bering Sea or whatever. There's other land-based jobs too, where a person has a shift where there's just no way they can get to a Saturday evening or Sunday morning Mass. Now, I'm going to put a little caveat on that's only an excuse to not come to Mass when the person's providing for their family. So if it's a teenager who's just making money to pay for their iPhone or their little hobbies or whatever, it's not good enough. You got to come to Mass, okay? That is not more important. God understands when we have to provide for our families, okay? So there's not a sinful quality in that. Anything else does not qualify as a reason. A soccer tournament that's in Eastern Washington, a wrestling tournament, ballet tournament, cribbage tournament, I don't care what it is not worth more on any level, not even on the same playing field as the Mass, no pun intended, right? Not even close. And when parents teach their children, because they are teaching their children a lesson, that their soccer is more important than Mass, or that Mass is second, third, fourth, fifth priority, they are teaching them the worst possible lesson Catholic parents could teach their children. And that is, God is worth less than Little League. All right, time to make sure that God comes first. We call it the Lord's Day because it is God's day, because it belongs to Him. We simply are participating in it, and when we take it away from Him, we are guilty of theft. Okay. All right. So there's that expectation. We're coming to Mass every Sunday. Now, I added to that a component of, I don't know if you would call it talent or time, but that when we do come to Mass, we fully participate. And that means when there's a time to speak, you speak the prayers. If I say the Lord be with you, you say, and with your spirit. If there's a time to sing, when we're singing the Gloria, you and everybody and myself, we are all singing the Gloria. We're not standing there, not doing anything. Again, bad example. It's when somebody's not singing at Mass, it's like an infection. It begins to infect the whole area around that person when they're not singing. And because the little kids look up and say, well, Dad's not singing, or Mom's not singing, or that person's not singing, and I don't want to sing because nobody else is now singing. It's an infection. And so we come to Mass to worship, to praise God, to adore God, to thank God, to plead with God. We come to Mass to participate, okay? So that's time. It's not coming to Mass just to be a lump on the log or to be sitting on the bench as we watch, the game. We are in the game. We must participate. Do you like watching a Seahawks game if one of the players is not pulling their weight, if they're just kind of loafing around? No, of course not. We want them off the field. Okay? So we want to participate fully. All right. The third component of this letter that I sent out was talent. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, okay? But I think it's a necessary component in order to get to the point where people want to give their talent. And in being a family, we need to love each other in order to want to do things together. Okay, to do things, and I don't mean do things like go on go play bingo together. I mean like do works of charity. I mean like learn about the faith. I mean like attend classes together. Do things like that. I mean like teach classes together. So the third component was that if the parish is offering coffee and donuts after Mass, then we go. We go. We spend a little bit of time with our brothers and sisters. Again, remember it's the Lord's Day. It belongs to Him. And our brothers and sisters are our fellow disciples. This is oftentimes the only time we see each other. And so this is a good time for us to set the context for us to get to know each other. They've done many, many studies on families that do not eat together every day and families that do eat together every day, that have dinner together every day. And the families that make that a priority are far more, what's the word I'm looking for? Functional. They're far more loving towards each other. They're far closer family when they eat together one meal every day, as opposed to a family that doesn't. Now, why is that? Is it because they're eating food together? Is it because we're getting together for coffee and donuts? No. It's because we're talking. Because we're getting to know each other. Okay, so in the family, that context is very important, obviously, because that's where kids have the opportunity to talk and to listen. And that's where, again, your talent in giving of the virtues that you have, giving your wisdom, and listening to each other and being able to be present to each other, it truly is a form of intimacy. Okay, so every time the parish is offering a meal after Mass or coffee and donuts, I'm asking people to go. Now, I know this is really hard for the introverts. I'm an introvert, right? You ask an introvert to go to a social, they would rather run into a burning building. I mean, it's very hard for introverts, I realize that. But the thing with introverts is you give them a mission, you give them a job to do in the context of that socializing, and we feel more comfortable. And so it's saying, okay, I got a job to do. This is not just about me talking about the weather with so-and-so. This is about me having an opportunity maybe to talk about faith or to talk about how God's working in my life or what the homily was about or whatever it was. Okay. So I'm reading a book right now. I've mentioned it already a couple times, a book by St. John Chrysostom. Now, he was a bishop of, at the time, was a thriving Christian city, a thriving Catholic city. And this was back in the 5th century. It is modern-day Istanbul, which was Constantinople back then. And so St. John Chrysostom is the bishop. He's the patriarch of this whole city, which means he's a very, very influential, very powerful man. He was also exiled several times by the emperor and the empress because they didn't like him proclaiming the gospel quite so boldly. Well, I've been reading a copy of some of his homilies on marriage and family life, and if you'd like to get it, you just do a search for him on the internet and St. Vladimir's Press. They are the publisher of the book, and you can get it on Amazon. I'd encourage any husband and wife who's serious about their faith to read it at some point. Now, there's a chapter on children. And the thing about this chapter is that it's really not on children per se. It's more on mom and dad. But he talks about how in 3 ways are the 3 most important things that he thinks that a mom and dad should teach their children. And he didn't number them per se. I just noticed as I was reading through the chapter, there were these 3 things. And so I numbered them. And what I realized was they tie in perfectly to stewardship. One is about time, one's about treasure, and one's about talent. And so I want to share them with you. He puts them all in the context, though, of obedience and discipline. He says that a family needs obedience and discipline. And he's not talking about the switch, right? He's not talking about beating your kids with your shoe or something like that, or the belt. That's not the obedience and discipline he's talking about. He's talking about truly loving obedience and loving discipline, where the children have been instilled with an intimacy and a love in the family that they want. They want to be functional. They want to be a good, healthy family. Okay, so he puts it in the context, because without obedience in the family, you have disobedience. With disobedience, it leads to the opposite of discipline, which is anarchy. Okay, and maybe I think all our families at some point can relate to that. At some point, we had a certain level of anarchy. I remember in my own family. There was a year when we stopped praying the rosary together as a family because life just got so busy. And what brought us back to praying the rosary together was the fact that we were losing, we were gaining anarchy. Our family, we were becoming very short-tempered with each other. We were not spending time together. We were not loving each other. And so finally my parents just said, you know what? We made a mistake. We allowed that to slip in our life. And so we went back to praying the rosary every day together. And you know what? We know what came back? That sense of discipline and respect for each other and love for each other. Okay. Not that we were ever perfect about it. All right. So, in the context of obedience and discipline, he talks about these three areas. And so the first is what I would say is the stewardship of time. He says, parents, you have to instill in your children a love for the scriptures. You have to teach them how to be in love with Jesus through the scriptures. That's a stretch for us as Catholics. Now, back then, that would have been a stretch also, because you have to remember this was the 5th century. They did not have printing presses. Families did not have copies of the Bible to sit on the shelf and collect dust, right? They didn't have that. And so the scriptures were not taken quite as for granted as we have them. If the parents wanted to instill the love for the scriptures in their children, they had to either come to Mass with whatever they used to write. I don't know what they used to write, a quill? I don't know. And some parchment, and they would have to write down the scriptures as they heard them proclaimed at Mass. The Mass was the only time they would have heard them audibly proclaimed. And so they would have had to take it in. So if they had nothing to write with, they would have had to memorize them, which was actually fairly common. People would memorize the scriptures because they had no way to write it down, or they were illiterate. Okay. Just because they were illiterate, though, doesn't mean they were dumb. It just means that they just didn't have the context of writing. Okay. In the church buildings, they would have written on the walls with paint. They would have written scripture verses. They would have used images, paintings to convey the stories of the scriptures. And so in that context, he would have said, parents, you need to teach your children a love for the scriptures. Because he knew in the context of those stories that Christ was then able to work. That's why Jesus used parables all the time. He used these stories. Okay? And so I offer that to parents, teach your children. So when your children are young and you're reading your children bedtime stories, use children's Bible stories. Use stories of the saints. Use stories that will edify them spiritually, that will help them fall in love with Jesus. That's what St. John Chrysostom is saying. Okay. Time. It takes time to do that, though. To sit down with your children and read them the stories. Or when they're learning to read, that they learn to read with these Bible stories, with these saint books. That's what they're being fed on as they're growing. In our schools, even in our Catholic schools, academics is really, really pushed. It's really important, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But often it's not in the context of the faith or Revelation or the Bible. And so I think John Chrysostom is just speaking to us and saying, hey, let's use the Bible more, a lot more. Let's make it the core of parents' time as you teach together, and just make that a daily occurrence. Okay. time. That's the stewardship of time with your children, spiritual aspect. Okay. The second thing he said is parents. Parents. Teach your children how to make good decisions in the Lord. Parents, teach your children how to make good decisions in the Lord. I think parents today try to teach their children how to make good decisions, but not necessarily in the Lord. Again, if you look at priorities in families, for most families today, the decisions they're teaching their children are not in the Lord. Maybe they're good practical decisions, they're decisions on how to be efficient with their time and their talents, but not necessarily in the Lord. And so I'm going to give you a little example. So when I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old, it was during the summer, my friends had these free passes to the roller rink that was about 1.5 miles from our house. And the free passes were for the whole summer, and they had their name printed on them, and they got them through the school they were attending. They went to the public school. Well, I was going to the Catholic school, so I didn't have one of these passes. So one day we wanted to go to the roller rink. I didn't have money. I don't remember if I didn't have money or I just didn't want to spend it. But anyways, one of my friends loaned me his pass. So that day I was Eduardo Campos. And so he loaned me his pass, and so I went skating with my friends, and I got in for free using Eduardo's pass, and he went by Eddie. But when I got home, we're having dinner as a family, kind of like I was talking about, and I began to kind of brag about what I had done, maybe because I didn't quite understand the ramifications of my actions, and my parents very quickly began to teach me about making good decisions in the Lord. Because what I began to realize was I had broken 2 commandments that day. I had lied, I was not Eduardo, and I had stolen. And so after dinner, my dad took me down to the roller rink, and I paid for the session that I had not paid for before, and I told them that I had cheated them, and I was sorry for doing that. Now, that was a very awkward moment. I wouldn't have chosen to do that willingly, but my dad was teaching me to make good decisions in the Lord. And so it's all those decisions that parents, I hope, are trying to teach their kids, and it has to do with, so when children do experience the real world for what it is, and the world as crude and crass as it can be, especially on the internet and TV and music, that they learn to make good decisions in the Lord. I have to tell you, one area of my life I still struggle in was when I was growing up, me and my brothers, we listened to rock music. And rock music was not very Christian. You had Christian rock and never liked it, but it was not very Christian at all. It was music that was very angry. It was often very angry. It instilled an emotion of anger, but it was also, so in that sense, it tended to be violent, but it also was very sensual and immoral in that sense as well. It was often very sexualized, and so rock music was not necessarily a good music to have in my life. And you know what? There's still times I'm tempted to go back to listening to the same music, and I listen to the words and it's like, oh, that's garbage. That's just bad. It's not good. And yet there's still that temptation. And so to make good decisions in the Lord is not always easy. All I have to do is say, Lord, do you want me to listen to this? No. I know the answer, but all right. Parents, help your children to make good decisions in the Lord. Really what St. John Chrysostom was saying is share your wisdom. Share your wisdom with your children. So the ways that you're making good decisions in the Lord, share that with your children. Because without it, your children are not going to make good decisions in the Lord. Okay? And this is not about, so if we teach our children that academics is a number 1 priority, we've already messed up. If we teach our children that sports is a number 1 or number 2 priority, we've already screwed up. The good decisions in the Lord is first teaching them that God, faith are number 1. Your family, your loved ones, your neighbor, number 2 in the context of number 1. And then everything else is third, okay? So that is talent. That was sharing your talents. Share your talents with your children. Share them so that they can grow up and be wise as well. Okay. The third one is the treasure. And St. John Chrysostom said, parents, teach your children to be detached from wealth. To be detached from wealth. He didn't say don't make money. He didn't say don't have wealth. He didn't say don't be successful. What he said is don't be attached. In other words, be detached from wealth. Are we obsessed with money? Do we become obsessed with money? Do we become obsessed with things? Now, if I were to be completely honest, I would have to say that's me, right? So today in the gospel, Jesus is telling the people, listen to the Pharisees because if they're teaching you the law of Moses, listen to them, but do not follow their example because they constantly seek out things for themselves. They want to be noticed, they want to be honored, they want to have power, they want to have wealth, they want to lord it over the people, so do not follow their example. But if they're teaching you the law, then listen to them. And so here I am. So he's saying they're hypocrites, in other words. And so here I am, I'm encouraging you to live a life of detachment. It is something I've always desired, or I shouldn't say that, it's something I've desired for many years as a priest, but I fail so frequently. I can become so obsessed with things. It's still a huge failing in my own life. And I'm constantly, it's like always on my prayer, and there's just a lot of, the roots go very deep for me on this one. Parents, teach your children to be detached from wealth so that they don't become like me, they don't become obsessed with money or things. And we live in a world that is, and it is because it's often not obsessed and not attached to our Lord. Okay, those were the three. That was the stewardship of treasure. All right, so if you've been taking notes during this, great. Bring this into your families, and I promise you, what I do promise you, is that there will be more peace and harmony in your families, and there'll be more peace and harmony in your lives. I notice in my own life as I become more and more detached from my selfish clingings, as I become more able to make good decisions in the Lord and then share that with others, and more as I fall in love with the scriptures and the stories and Jesus' work in my life, the more I have peace and harmony in my own life. So, all right. God bless you. Next week, I will be recording from somewhere because I'm going to be going on vacation after the Sunday Masses. So I will be recording somewhere in Oregon or Nevada or California or somewhere. All right. I'll see you then. God bless.